We have with us two very eminent speaker and discussant today to talk about a very critical issue, critical as far as India's growth process at this juncture is concerned. The title of this talk today, Multiplying Multi-Plants and Large Plant Sizes, Consequences, Costs and Rationale. It says it explores the insights presented. Arvind will be presenting the insights that he has as far as this paper is concerned. I would say it's bringing forth us on a subject that's very critical, as I said, a dimension that is relatively less discussed. And an aspect of that dimension that I think is absolutely novel and has a whole lot of implications for us to consider moving to the future in terms of manufacturing competitiveness as well as employment. Two challenges that India faces at this point and are very critical in terms of finding solutions, in terms of discussions and debates that are going on and that need to be taken forward. So as I said, we have two eminent speakers with us today. One is, of course, both are very well known. I don't need to introduce either one of them, but I'll take the trouble of going through the formalities for both. We have the speaker, the main speaker, who will be making the presentation, Arvind Subramanian, who's a senior fellow at present at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and has been associated with the Institute since 2007. He was a Dennis Weatherstone Senior Fellow at the Institute during 2013 and 14, and was on leave for public service from 2014 to August 2023, during which I think he was also the Chief Economic Advisor in India. I particularly want to mention this. Coming from academia myself, it's very heartening to see academics moving across to policy making. Rare in India, but nonetheless, those who've come, I think, have made a mark, as have you, Arvind. Mr. Ahluwalia, who's the discussant today, I don't think I'm going to go through all of his positions in the past so many years. I'll say just one sentence about him, two rather. One, that he has been and continues to be the most or among the most eminent voices on economic policy making in India, and if I may say so, even in the world. Second, I think I want to say this, that Mr. Ahluwalia is one person I admire for this very, very big reason, in terms of his ability to be able to transcend the fields of research and policy making and speaking as a policy maker, even when he's coming from in-depth, very detailed research. I think that ease of communicating to a policymaker, to a layman, and to a student, to even academics, is a quality that is very rare, exceptional, and he's one of those exceptional people. Thank you so much both for being here today to speak on a subject, as I said, very critical, very important. Over to you, Arvind.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I want to thank Lavish and the Center and Amita for having me here. It's great to have Montek as a discussant for reasons that Amita quite rightly kind of highlighted. It's wonderful to be able to come here, and this is kind of the winter season, as they say, when all the birds, the migrating birds from the west come and try and give their yarn and go back, and with kind of indifferent consequences. But it's really a delight to be here. So first of all, let me say that the topic or what I'm going to present is joint work with Abhishek, Anand, who's here. Abhishek, can you, and Naveen Thomas, who's about to come. Naveen is not here. And I do want to emphasize that these youngsters, in fact, the key insight of this paper, the key empirical finding, owes entirely to them. And I'm kind of just a vehicle for articulating something that they actually discovered in the data, which I've found fascinating. And I think that's what I want to share with you. So Abhishek and Naveen will answer all the difficult questions because they know much more than I do about this. Okay, so let me start by saying, of course, in some ways, I would say one of India's deepest puzzle is why we've been unsuccessful at labor-intensive manufacturing. All of you know the data. Maybe we've been subject to, there's a term that goes around saying premature industrialization. I think even that is misleading because we never had enough to kind of deindustrialize. I think it's just a case of stunted manufacturing and stunted industrialization. But I think the puzzle is really the following, and this is what Devesh and I are going to explore in our book that's forthcoming next year. Is the puzzle is that why Indian manufacturing did badly in the dark era of planning is not a mystery. I mean, we can have all kinds of good explanations, but the puzzle is why is it that after we liberalized, we did many of the right things, under Shankar and Montek, who are here, and they deserve so much credit for that. That despite that, we grew rapidly, we globalized rapidly after the mid-1990s, and despite that, we were not able to reverse, 3 decades of bad performance. So the puzzle is not why India has had stunted industrialization, but why has it persisted despite 3 to 4 decades of rapid growth and globalization? So that's the puzzle. In a sense, it's the puzzle of the neoliberal era, the growth era, the dynamic era is when we weren't able to. So that's, I think, India's deepest puzzle. And of course, lots of people have focused on this whole gamut of related factors, explanations relating to regulation, labor laws, firm size, competitiveness, inability to export, so on. But the focus in India, I think it's fair to say, whenever we discuss size, especially in the academic literature, it tends to get obsessed with the Industrial Disputes Act, and therefore with all the kind of thresholds in the laws. Can you hire and fire beyond 100? What are the costs? What are the penalties? And then, some state governments in the recent past increased the threshold to 300, and we're kind of obsessed with wondering, did it help? Did it not help? Etc. etc. I think the more important question in India may well be not why firms are small, but why we haven't had very, very large firms and enough of very large firms. I think is kind of one of at least the pieces of the puzzle in trying to explain why manufacturing hasn't done well in India. And why I think we're excited about this paper is that there is evidence of a new phenomenon which for some reason has kind of escaped so much. I mean, people have worked on this, especially with the annual survey of industry data for decades, and yet somehow this phenomenon has escaped most research or almost all the research. And so it was very exciting to kind of come upon this, thanks to Abhishek and Naveen, and then to kind of think through what it means and what the implications are. So let me, so I'm going to, basically there are 3 findings or 4. One, we're just going to show you how quantitatively significant this phenomenon of multi-plants is. And the definition of multi-plants here is very simple. One firm operating multiple plants or enterprises in one state. So it's not even across states, it's just in one state, firms operating multiple plants. So it's a quantitatively significant feature of the data and of the real world. 2, if you don't account for it, our understanding of how large firms are in India and how the size of firms has changed over time is actually misleading, and even the sign gets reversed. I mean, I'll show you some research which says that firms have been growing, but actually, if you take account of this multi-plant phenomenon, I think you get just the opposite effect. Number three, they're associated with lower productivity, which therefore has implications for manufacturing competitiveness and export. And four, I think this is really is more speculative. The really interesting part is that it does shed some new light on regulations and labor markets in India, because it seems to be that multi-plants are just another mechanisms for firms to remain small in order to diversify and hedge risk. So these are the four kind of broad findings that I'll elaborate on this. So first, the phenomenon itself. This is a chart that shows what is the, and just for the sake of all that I'm saying, mostly holds true for manufacturing as a whole, but we're going to focus on labor-intensive manufacturing, because that's where the heart of the problem is. And it has been in India that we haven't had enough share of labor-intensive manufacturing. A simple fact for that, of course, our global export share of labor-intensive industries was at 3% about 25 years ago, kind of crept up to a little bit over to 4, maybe a little bit over 4. Now it's back to 3, 3.5. So it's been absolutely stagnant. And what this shows is that multi-plants, which accounted for about 15-16% of employment in the early 2000s, late 90s, now the red line, 43% of employment in all of manufacturing from the annual survey of industry data is accounted for by multi-plants. As a share of output, it's about 35% in terms of the number of plants. It's now about 30%. So it's not a small, cute, obscure kind of thing that affects one corner of the real world. It's actually very significant. I don't want to go through all of this. It's based on, we have basically two big sources on Indian manufacturing in India, the ASI and then the economic census. They both have their pros and cons, and we're going to show you what we've done with both of them. We focus on private sector plants. That's where labor laws apply, as opposed to public sector plants, which have their own dynamic on labor, on employment. We focus on labor-intensive industries, and we focus on large firms, which we define as firms above that employ more than 200 non-managerial workers, for reasons I'll explain later on. Now, I'm going to. So the first fact is that when you don't take into account the multi-plant phenomenon, I'm going to give you one kind of a telling example of what the measurement issue is in this. So this is data on one of India's most successful exporting firms and largest employers. So the blue line, if you went to the ASI data, the blue line will tell you that this firm is one firm that employed about 13,000 workers in 2005 and is now employing about 85,000, 90,000 workers. So you would say, wow, what is all this nonsense about India impeding firms from becoming big? Here's a case of a firm that's actually gone from 13,000 employees to 85,000 employees in the era of growth and globalization. It turns out actually that this is a firm that has multiple plants, the multi-plant phenomenon. It's actually, in 2005, it had 10 plants, which went up to 45 plants in one state. By the way, it's in one state, as I said earlier. And therefore, the average size, the maximum size, is well below what this blue line would lead you to believe. So, for example, the average employee per plant in this is about 13,000, has been about 13,000, or 13 or 14,000. And even in the largest plant, the maximum employment was about something like 13, 14,000. So the red line tells you, the employment size of the biggest plant. Whereas if you looked at the blue line and looked at the data without accounting for multi-plants, you would think that there's one plant with a lot of employment. Actually, there are now 45 plants with much fewer employment. So this is the phenomenon, what happens when you don't take account of multi-plants. And the paper is just showing that this is a much broader phenomenon than just this. So you underestimate the number of plants, and then what is very critical is that you underestimate the size of the right tail. So the errors that are happening are not just happening on average, they're happening on the right tail of the distribution. Now, yeah.
I'm very slow these days.
Yeah, no.
Can
Shankar.
you go back one slide? And not giving those numbers quite reflect what you're saying. And can you just point out?
So for example, so average employee per plant is actually 1,200 throughout this. That's what, because there are actually 45 plants. So think of the 80,000 by 45, right?
When you say observed, that's in the inside.
That's it. Where's this? Exactly. And this is the maximum size of each of the plants because it's much smaller than that. Yeah.
So 2023 could be even lower than this, much lower than this.
Our last thing is 21-22 data, right? 22-23 data. The last data point. 22-23. So I think 23-24 is out, and we're going to update that based on this. So the question is that how do you then get at the true distribution of the how do you kind of account for this error? How do you estimate or guesstimate the true distribution in the data? And we do something very simple actually. We have the economic census, and the economic census actually does record everything plant by plant. You don't have the multi-plant thing. So what you see there is that our hypothesis is that if you took the distribution of single plants in the ASI data, that is a better measure of the true distribution rather than the multi-plant, because by definition, the multi-plant, you're making errors, you're counting many firms as one firm. So you want to get rid of that. And the way we show that is to show, again, just to be clear, you can go to the economic census. And so this line is the single plant distribution from the ASI. And the blue line, so the blue line is from the ASI, the green line is from the economic census. So, and we have this data for 2012-13 because that's when the last economic census was done. So if you plot the economic census data, which is not contaminated by this multi-plant phenomenon, and match it with the ASI. So in the ASI, you then ignore the multi-plants for the moment and say, what is the true distribution? It seems very close to what the economic census distribution is. So we fit that distribution then to the total data, and then we come up with, how many firms are big on the right tail, et cetera, et cetera. And you see that compare that with the multi-plant distribution, there's a big difference. So the multi-plant distribution is the outlier, whereas the single plant is very close to what the economic census is. So we kind of, hypothesize that if you wanted the true distribution of plant size in the data, you should look at the single plant data and ignore multi-plants. Now, so as I said, so the big error, therefore, that people have made is to suggest, so this is a very influential paper by Batra and Chang Tai-Sheh. They look at this data and say, look at the second bullet point. They say that large firms grew in size, and they show this for the 90th and 95th percentile. It increased substantially the size measured in terms of employment. And they say it is because of contractual labor. The rise in contractual labor has allowed firms to become bigger over time. And it's a very plausible and somewhat compelling argument. And we're going to show that actually, that is actually not true, because they've been measuring all these things based on the multi-plant data. If you actually, so I'm just going to highlight, it's a very complicated table. I just want you to focus, let's say, on labor-intensive manufacturing. This is the 95th percentile firm. What is the size? The size is, it has 2,100 employees. In the 2020s, it's 2,300. This is what you would see, this change, if you just did not take account of the multi-plant phenomenon. And that's why, Bertrand and Chang Tai-Sheh, actually the size of firms went up. When you actually adjust for that, then it actually goes down. The size i.e. the 95th percentile firm in the early 2000s employed 2,000, and it's come down to 1,700 over time. So in fact, the right tail, the size of firms on the right tail has actually either remained constant or declined. And you can do this, you can measure size in terms of what is the size of employment. You can also measure it by employment share of the 95th percent firm. No matter how you do it, the sign is negative or not positive. Certainly not positive, in many cases negative. So in other words, the puzzle deepens despite Montek and Shankar and all their illustrious colleagues, despite the fantastic things they did over this, in the era of growth and dynamism, actually firms, and despite contractualization, in the neoliberal era, we got, and I'm going to show you the size of contract, size of firms actually may have declined, size of large firms may actually have declined. So this is kind of, I think, a very kind of, now, why do we care about this? I'll just give you one chart. We care about it because of obviously labor productivity. The blue dot is for single plants. What is this? Measures log output per worker, and we're controlling for the state and the sector in which we're trying to compare like with like. That is, you look at compare plants in the same state, in the same sector. For single plants versus multi-plants, what you find is that multi-plants have on average something like are 9% less productive, and the wedge between the two rises with employment size. So in fact, and the intuition is actually very simple. It's essentially that multi-plants are, so here you're basically, let's say you're comparing a single plant of 100 and a multi-plant of 100. Actually, a multi-plant is 2 plants of 50, and therefore you get scale economies, and therefore they are much less productive. That's a kind of a productivity thing. I mean, we do this all with regression and things. So coming back to this, look at global market share in the most important, I would say, manufacturing sector from an employment point of view. Apparel, see how flat the Indian line is. China has gone up and down. Bangladesh has been rising. Of course, we'll see what happens now. But the tragedy of this chart is, the real tragedy of this chart is that when China lost market share, we did not gain a fraction of that. That's the biggest tragedy that this chart exemplifies. In the era, not in the dark era of planning and socialism, in the era of liberalization and growth, we were unable to capitalize on this. Now, we're just comparing India and Bangladesh. We have data on Bangladesh for 2012-13, and essentially the only thing I want you to focus on, if you were to look at the multi-plant data, you would think that India and Bangladesh are very similar on the large size, but actually this is the true number when you take account of multi-plants. And what you indeed find is that, greater than 100,000, employing more than 1,000 employees, Bangladesh, what 45% of the firms account for that. In India, less than 15. And so by definition, Bangladesh firms are much larger in the apparel sector, and that explains part of the, obviously Bangladesh is a smaller country, therefore the incentives to export will be greater. So it's not perfect, but even allowing for all that, you find that size in the apparel sector, Bangladeshi firms are much bigger than firms in India. Now, this is the really curious part. Now, you see this contract workers as a share of total workers in manufacturing. And we see that this has gone up. In around 84, there was virtually nothing. In the early 2000s, it's about 16-17%. And today it's almost upwards. It's about 41% today. This is a staggeringly high number. The share of contract workers in all manufacturing in India. And of course, it's a bit different for labor-intensive and non-labor-intensive industries. So the one possible consequence of this is that because India allowed, by the way, it's also true of the public sector in India, because of the possibility of getting contract labor, the firms therefore had to encounter rest problems with all the regulatory ecosphere in India, and therefore started to become bigger. And that's the claim of Chiang Tai-shek and others. And of course, we know that firms such as team leads act as brokers in the labor markets. They take upon themselves, so they are the official employers, and then they outsource or they loan out their employees to firms, because then the burden of compliance with all the regulatory paraphernalia is with team leads rather than with the manufacturing units, and therefore that relieves these units of some of the costs of compliance and all the risks that come associated with it. But here's the thing. So if you break down the share of contractual workers in labor-intensive and non-labor-intensive industries, it's kind of a puzzle because it goes the other way. You would think that the more labor-intensive the industry, you would see more contract workers because that's where the employment is bigger, and therefore the problems related with this, associated with employment are greater. But in fact, you see just the opposite. So our explanation for that, to some extent, is the right-hand side chart, where you see that the contractual worker phenomenon is much greater and rising in single plants than in multi-plants. So this is, I think, a key kind of piece of the clue. And the way we interpret this is the following, that contractualization and multi-plants are both different mechanisms by which firms decide to hedge against regulatory and political risks associated with employment. So if you have a single plant, you want to keep it small by having more labor. But you can do it similarly through multi-plants, because by definition, you have more plants, and in each plant, you have fewer workers. So the multi-plant phenomenon is another way of kind of diversifying your risk. So, as I've just said, multi-plants provide flexibility just from the fact of having many plants, or to put it in more technical economic jargon, the possibility is that firms are expanding at the extensive margin in order to remain small at the intensive margin because of all the problems associated with having too many workers, the regulatory and political risks. Now, and here, I think what certainly I learned from my stint here in government and talking to people is that there is too much of this obsession with the law per se, because I think the risks are much broader than just regulation and laws. There's also the broader political risk. I mean, put very crudely, if there's a problem in your plant, will the government, wash its hands off you and leave you to, negotiate with whoever, or leave capital and labor, or will, government be a facilitator and actually, be an honest interlocutor between capital and labor? And the CEO of the firm that I've just shown, he said very explicitly that we choose not to grow as a matter of diversifying these policy and legal risks. Of course, regulations are one dimension of that risk, but it's not the only dimension. It's much broader than that. And of course, take the extreme situation. If you have a dispute in one plant, you can shut it down. Whereas if you have multi-plants, you'll have to shut down. If you have multi-plants, you can shut down one small plant if you have a dispute in one plant. Whereas if you have the same amount of employees all located in one plant, then of course the risks are much greater. And so that's kind of the kind of understanding that it's thrown up by this phenomenon of multi-plants. Now, having painted a gloomy picture, full disclosure, I know I advise the government of Tamil Nadu, so maybe I'm overhyping what's happening there. But there are glimmers of hope on the horizon. I just wrote a piece in the FT on the success of manufacturing in Tamil Nadu. And what seems to me very different about this new wave of investments in Tamil Nadu is that you are getting investments where employment sizes are, big in a way that we've never really seen in India before in the private sector. There's a Foxconn plant that employs 18 workers. There's a Tata plant in Hosur that's going to employ 40,000. There are Taiwanese and Vietnamese firms in the footwear industry that are employing 15, 20, 25,000 workers. And this is really a kind of refreshingly new phenomenon that's happening. And I think this is the big China plus one opportunity that lies ahead of us. which is where I think we are failing as a country and as government in not paying sufficient attention and not going on mission mode, as it were. Because essentially what we want, see, the puzzle is, why is Tamil Nadu the wages in Tamil Nadu are 3 times probably in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, or 4 times, and yet even the labor intensive investment is going to Tamil Nadu. But if you want India to boom once again, and provide inclusive growth, this phenomenon has to spread to the Hindi heartland. And I think that is the central challenge for India today. How do we take advantage of this fairly brief window, narrow window of opportunity, and get this this phenomenon, attract manufacturing by attracting firms that are willing to employ at scale, and thus provide a lot of employment and make growth inclusive, as it were. So just to summarize, we have a really quantitatively significant phenomenon that's kind of somehow escaped the attention of a lot of research, which is this multi-plant phenomenon. It really distorts our understanding of firm size at any point in time, and definitely the evolution of firm size, especially large firm size, over time. And once we correct for that, we find that actually, as I said, we have firm sizes, large firms have not begun bigger. This seems to be a mechanism for risk hedging risk against both regulatory and political risk. Contract labor has been one mechanism. This seems to be another mechanism where you proliferate at the expense of margin in order to remain small. Now, last very important point I want to emphasize is that this desire to remain small happens, as you can see here. I want to show you this, for example. Whether you think of contract labor or the multi-plant phenomenon, it happens all along the employment distribution. So the whole obsession with the Industrial Dispute Act and saying that, oh, it's the threshold that's creating these pressures to remain small is actually not true. It's much broader than that. The desire to remain small happens all along the employment distribution. You have 1,000, you could have been 2,000, but you remain to be 1,000. You're 50,000, you could be at 50,000, but you remain at 25,000. So this phenomenon is not just about, and the academic literature, especially coming from abroad, has obsessed with this Industrial Dispute Acts and the threshold. It's actually much broader than that, and that's what we need to think about. What are the broader risks that are making firms behave in this way and remain small? Finally, as I've said, there are glimmers of hope on the horizon. I think the China +1 strategy opportunity is opening up for India. One state, maybe 2. I would say Tamil Nadu is certainly doing it based on comparative advantage. Gujarat may or may not be doing it based on comparative advantage. We don't know. Maybe it's also getting with a little bit of help from my friends. But it's true. But this is an opening, an opportunity, a narrow one. So the question is, why can't we get more such investments and at this kind of scale than we ever got in the past? And that's what I think we need to focus on going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And over to Mr. Ahluwalia.
Thank you, Amita. It's kind of conventional practice that the discussant is supposed to tear into the paper and say all the things that are wrong with it. I'm not going to do that because I think it's very good paper, actually. I mean, I just observed, I use the word observed rather than celebrated, my 81st birthday last week. And when you're that old, I mean, one of the interesting things is that you can always get new ideas come up, but very rarely do you get a factual piece of information that you had no idea was affecting the outcome, although the data was all over the place, and that is this multi-plant phenomenon. So I really congratulate you for digging it out. In fact, it's quite a devastating critique, not only of the fellows based abroad, but also the fellows, after all, based in India, that we haven't, I didn't even know, by the way, that the ASI criminally and totally idiotic practice of aggregating plants within the state and reporting as a single unit. You're allowed to have different units if you're in different states. I mean, I don't know, but I can understand reporting plants and I can understand aggregating, but this thing I didn't know about. So whichever of you can distribute the credit with your,
Completely Abhishek and Naveen.
well, then congratulations to both. You know, at the same time, I think I'm going to say a few other things, but I must point out one criticism, which if you will put on the opening slide, I will draw attention. This one, the cover.
Let me help Montek here to unleash his wrath on us.
That's it. Now, my only criticism is that this picture is quite clearly European. I mean, sloped roof, that thing looks like Amsterdam. It's a wonderful presentation, but I would suggest take a picture of Dharavi or Tirupur or something.
Can I, Montek, this points, mea culpa or my thing, but this is, it shows you how Western biased
Absolutely.
Chat GPT
Absolutely.
is based on Chat GPT, right? Right, Abhishek? Yes, exactly.
Yes, even with ChatGPT, when you got this, if you had said, could I have some Indian something, they would have given you
Yeah, they would.
something. Anyway,
Yeah.
that. So this is just to let you know that I've actually thought about it. That's the only criticism. Otherwise, very stimulating, and I just want to make a few comments on that. Now, I think the general point that liberalization was supposed to lead to economic efficiency. I mean, there are a hell of a lot of people who are involved in it, but Shankar and I have been singled out for attack.
No. For praise, unambiguous
If
praise.
it's attack, that's fair enough. If it's credit, then I think it should be spread more widely. I do think that we generally did feel, and I still think there was a lot of validity in it, but liberalization will lead to efficiency. I mean, had we not liberalized, things would have been infinitely worse. Okay. But it is also true that too many of us, certainly me and probably many of my friends in the early days, did think that this wretched IDR Act and the 100, the 100 was actually brought in as a consequence of liberalization in 1980. Because Mrs. Gandhi did a few fiddly little things, which I wouldn't call liberalization. My good friend Sujit Bhalla calls it tinkering. But her economic advisor, the late Arjun Sengupta, wonderful fellow, he sort of told her, ma'am, this you may get some criticism from the left. The left was much more important in those days than it is now. So why don't we do something else which will please the workers, and we reduce what was earlier 300 limit to 100. And I was a bit disappointed that when we did the second round of genuine liberalization, we only raised it from 100 to 300, the most recent legal change. So I think that was not enough. But even then, it was very clear from some papers I'd read that 100 was not the critical cutoff point, because there were far too many firms at 50, excessive number of firms, to say that everything's fine except for this wretched labor law. And of course, there was an entire literature that evolved around why do firms remain small. And there were people who said, look, it's not just labor laws, there's infrastructure, logistics, access to capital, access to land, blah, blah, blah. But all of that is, of course, true. But I do think that what this paper actually brings out is that maybe more important, certainly more important than the 100 worker limit for closing of that only applies for closing of a firm. More important than that is really all the other you can call it ease of doing business, but all the things that make entrepreneurs believe that if you raise your head too much above the horizon, it'll get cut off. Therefore, keep it small. And I think what this demonstrates very powerfully is how valid that was. And I think the comparison with Bangladesh is absolutely striking, because a lot of people think that the reason Bangladesh does this is that they don't have the hire and fire laws that we do, or for some reason that they can keep wages very low. But I think what this does indicate is that we do need to think about that. So honestly, I think this is a treasure trove of data that you've dug out. And quite frankly, it would be interesting to see how does it vary? How do some of these conclusions vary across sectors? I mean, for example, you, which is being a good Tamil origin guy, I commend you for praising Tamil Nadu. I think they're doing wonderful work. But you know, the Foxconn example is not a proof that Tamil Nadu has learned the real lessons. It would have learned the real lessons if it did something in Tirupur. And the fact is, you can't even start Foxconn unless they tell you that, look, you want us, right, we want to have 100,000 workers, blah, 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 so much land, hospital facilities, etc. So over there, what is really happening is either you want the China plus one in that area, in other words, electronics, in which case only two firms to talk to. And pretty soon you work out that if you send some joint secretary or minister or whatever to the two firms that matter, they all come back and say, look, without this, you're not going to have it. And you say, okay, we go ahead. But you know, is Tamil Nadu, and I hope it is, by the way, because I do believe that they are. I mean, I disagree. I must find things I disagree with. Otherwise, it's not a very interesting conversation. I mean, you said that, you know, unless this happens in UP, this is far too strong a test to impose. I think that India's ability to compete with China can be quite satisfactorily established to anyone's satisfaction as long as enough states in the South do it. Thereafter, UP will learn simply by observing where it's happening. And indeed, the more quality labor in Bihar, UP, etc., will all migrate to the South. That will generate other problems. The South may not mind that too much because it will in due course affect its population representation in the parliament also. And it's easier for them to say, look, what is this crap you're talking about? Why does my kid have to migrate 1,000 miles away and eat sambar in Italy instead of whatever Rajma Chawal? Because you have these silly rules. Let's imitate what Tamil Nadu is doing. So that's, I think, but a more interesting point is within Tamil Nadu, what are they doing on Tirupur? So I think that's something you need. And then, you know, the polar opposites of the totally new semiconductor manufacturing, Foxconn is not semiconductor, electronic manufacturing of high-end smartphones, and at the other end, apparel, there'd be things in between. Very interesting, for example, to know what is happening in Tamil Nadu on leather, and is it different from Kanpur? My guess would be that it should be hugely different. If it is not, then we really need to examine this hypothesis. And your data would allow you to do that. Just pull out the leather industry in both these things and see what's happening. So that's one point. I mean, there's more than one point, but it's my kind of general reaction. Yeah, I think coming back a little, I'll stop in 2 minutes because I think many people will have questions to ask. You know, the political connectedness issue. I mean, I think what this brings out, your underlying hypothesis is that the system operates a little bit like a lawnmower, where the blades are set at a height of whatever X, and the message to the entrepreneurs is that keep each plant below X, otherwise you get chopped off. So you like Tamil Nadu, you like the workers, you like the climate, you like whatever, fine, let's just have more plants and so on. I mean, clearly one way in which this could improve is if blades were set higher, and that may be a matter of regulations, etc. But the other thing is that, you know, I think and this is where Foxconn comes in, big guys have the huge advantage of political connectedness.
Correct.
I mean, if you're employing 100,000 or 50,000 people, you get to be able to see the chief minister. And therefore, the local sales tax guy, he can still cause little problems here and there, and you know how to handle those. But you have political connectedness. Now, unfortunately, in our countries, what is happening right now is a massive suspicion of crony capitalism. So the question is, he's the author of this lovely phrase, stigmatized capitalism. Now, I don't have to mention which are the firms traditionally associated with stigmatized capitalism. But the fact of the matter is that we're in serious danger of stigmatizing any successful capitalist,
Yeah.
especially if it's a recent one. So, I mean, Tatas cannot be stigmatized because they were selling steel to the Sydney Harbour Bridge, long before independence, so they're okay. L&T cannot be stigmatized because they've been there for such a long time. But, I mean, if you had something like an Elon Musk appearing, who suddenly rose, the great contribution of India and its politics is that we managed to avoid the stigmatization of the software sector. And this is where labor comes in again, because I think the ability to create political problems is not unconnected with unionization.
Right.
Had Infosys or TCS or whatever, the Wipro and all being unionized, then it would have been interesting to see what happens. But the point that I'm making is that somehow, I think chief ministers have to be told that when you go to before investors, please build into your speech. And I mean, all of them have guys who consult whatever it is about their speeches. You should be able to say that, during my 5 years, these 5 firms have grown from 5,000 employees to 10,000 employees. And if you could list 10 of them, that would create a real value. I mean, it's no good being in Haryana, for example. And Maruti, of course, is the outstanding example. It was a good one. But there's nobody else in the manufacturing area that you can think of. So in all probability, the chief minister will say, well, Haryana is the location of Rakhi Gari, which 9,000 years ago was a major urban center. That's fine. It doesn't impress anybody if they're deciding to put money there. On the other hand, if you could say that, look, in the last 10 years, the following companies have come, and they may not be of the Foxconn variety, but 10 years ago, they had 2,000 workers, and now they have 10,000, and there are 10 of them. That would make a big difference. And I think we are not, by the way, in our own analysis of state performance, maybe Niti Aayog is doing it, I don't know, I must check out their website. This aspect is nowhere picked up. I mean, we keep talking about investment is high or low or staggering or something. And the usual argument is that for some reason, private investors are not investing, and you can put in whatever insults you want, but the state is investing. Now, quite frankly, that to my mind is virtually a guarantee of misallocation of resources. But today we take a lot of pride. I mean, seeing all these S&P and what have you are saying that, growth seems to be slowing down, but don't worry, in Q4, government capex is going to shoot up. Coming from where I do, we've seen that movie before. And I think we want to ask, why are the private guys not investing? And it becomes doubly so because there's a lot of energy. A lot of these smaller guys are relocating to Dubai. And I've been trying to find out. It's very difficult to find out. But I suggest you do some little experimental, I think you need to be a sociologist in this area. I mean, the problem with economics is it assumes that data is known and fixed and valid. And all of these are incorrect. I mean, as your paper shows, first of all, the data is not known. Yeah. I didn't know about multi-plants. Secondly, it's not fixed because whenever you find a problem, they change it. And thirdly, there's a question of validity, which is an overwhelm. But sociology, I suggest you just go and dig out 10 names of moderately sensible looking firms that have relocated. I've talked to some of them, by the way, and they all say that you have no idea how difficult it is to manage business if you have a winning idea and you want to expand. And therefore, what I do is I have the firm in India, I set up another firm in Dubai, all the marketing, all the financing, and everything is done by that firm. Now, I mean, the trouble is if we do this, we will basically end up having the equivalent of body shops, not in software, which was once the complaint, but even in manufacturing. But anyway, great paper. Thank you very much. You should make it into a film. That's the only thing that sells these days.
Or podcast or.
Thank you. We'll move on to open the house for questions. I see a few hands raised. I'm just debating whether I should put my question first or should I move to the audience. But I think because Tirupur has already been mentioned, I'm going to say this. Tirupur, Tamil Nadu, you lay a lot of emphasis on A, textiles and clothing, B, on Tamil Nadu, and C, Foxconn at the end, Tirupur has been the hub, was always the hub as far as textiles and clothing is concerned. And we were doing very well till about 2010, 2013. In fact, the time point at which you show the Bangladesh plants, So we did increase to 3%, 4%, we were still worth reckoning with entity as far as global shares were concerned. Things started to change after that when we really had a change in the global demand as far as textiles and clothing is concerned.
Right.
A lot was done in Bangladesh, even in terms of technological advancement, which we never did. The lean manufacturing technology, which is so much talked about in the literature with respect to textiles and clothing in Bangladesh, So, I mean, my question really is, that Tirupur was doing well, not so. There are other factors that were really very, very important, in terms of the entire demand having moved to synthetics, our emphasis on cotton, the duty structure that we prevailed with as a consequence of that, So it was really that led to a reduction in the exports. Or was it, as you say, Bangladesh went ahead, because it had larger plants? How much of, emphasis would one lay on this kind of, the distinction that you're bringing in as far as multi-plants fall or within multi-plants or within what is called a large plant is really a multi-plant, So how much weight do we actually attribute to this aspect, That's one. My second is when you talk about this Foxconn, etc., Tamil Nadu, in terms of, I mean, by the way, this Tata and Wistron, etc., increasing their share in employment or the numbers that they're going to employ is very recent. I think these are announcements. They've yet to kind of really come to fruition in that sense. But what we've seen in case of electronics, particularly as far as mobile phones are concerned, is an increase in our export share already. We see that in the last couple of years. Only in mobile phones. The emphasis that I would lay here on is, that you have Apple leading this. You have Foxconn following this, Two questions that come from this, The fact that Apple that brings about the integration with global value chains for India, brings in the contract manufacturers, Taiwanese, otherwise, that really pushes the exports and sets up the ecosystem. Or as far as the second question, the large firms, when they are foreign firms, are able to better diversify the risk or deal with the risks that you are identifying in your multi-plant identification. I think these are my two questions, and I'll move on now to.
Can I respond because there are two sets, or I'm happy to wait as well. I don't want people to lose sight of the.
Okay, please.
Yeah. Just on this, I think that firstly. We would never claim that this is the only explanation, whole bunch of things going on, but we focus on this because it's relatively new and undocumented and seems to be important. So by no means is this the, no phenomenon in the world it can be monocausally explained. But on and both of you asked this question that, which are related. Tirupur, as you said, was basically cotton-based textile. And it grew and then it collapsed. And essentially, what this shows is that we're better able to attract the new thing than to be able to, help revive, diversify, kind of existing stuff. And there's a dynamic there which I don't fully understand, but I think you're right that we should do that. Because in your question about leather, in fact, in Tamil Nadu, the same distinction. Kanpur is, leather-based. The new stuff, all the new stuff, life and apparel is based on, synthetic leather, and all the new investments coming in. So it's like the old stuff is kind of dying. The new stuff is the more thing, and Tamil Nadu is able to capture that stuff, but not able to kind of convert the old stuff into new stuff and so on. By the way, the Tata Hosur plant is now there. 40,000 is an actual, not a. Now, I think you make a very good point, and it's something that I've kind of gone back and forth on this, that our inability to be part of global value chains, how much of that is related to the fact that we were never able to attract foreign direct investment? And I think is, and Yashing Huang, who studied China and India quite a bit, this is his kind of indictment of India, that you guys, because if you look at the successes in East Asia, Korea was unusual because it did it without FDI, but all the others, Taiwan, the East Asians, and China, and now Vietnam, and Bangladesh, and Mexico.
Cambodia, that's coming up.
Cambodia is coming up. And so the question is that, is there something about our ecosphere that doesn't allow, and of course their trade policy has always been a big part of that, right? That domestic firms, because of trade policy and many other things, have not been able to join value chains. And we've also not been as favorable to foreign direct investment. So the combination of those two has made us not be part of global value chains. And I think not being part of global value chains has affected exports of labor-intensive industries. So there's a kind of FDI story here lurking in the background as well. You're absolutely right.
That's good. Absolutely correct. I mean, that's a different story.
Yeah, but
and you need to go into it big time. But anyway, we can do that.
Okay, we'll move on to, Dr. Acharya.
Yeah,
Sorry.
no.
Okay, sorry,
In
please.
fact, you made only couple of industries example. But I was just wondering, like, we have major companies, the PSUs, Coal India, BHEL, ONGC, SAIL. And in fact, in 2000, they overemployed just because they thought that they would grow much larger. But over the year, the employees retired and their size has become lower. Let me just give you an example of Coal India Limited. With 500 million tons of production, Coal India Limited employed 4.5 lakh people. And today, with 1,000 million tons of coal production, they're employing only 2.5 million, 2.5 lakh people. Now, that is the kind of size which has gone down in PSU because they overemployed in 2000, 2004 because they thought that, and there was also a government pressure. Now, the problem currently on the employment side, if I just have a look at the refineries have not come up in last 10 years. The entire refinery supply chain or thermal power supply chain that employs huge number of people. Gas production has not gone up. So how the manufacturing will really go up? Because during your time, the refining capacity of about 123 million ton was laid. So obviously the employment was much higher.
What is the question?
Yes.
If you get,
So I was just wondering that your employment scenario for the same 2003 and 2023 or 2000 is almost the same. That may not be a case in case of PSUs.
Okay, we take about 4 questions. I believe.
Shankar,
Dr. Acharya. Yeah.
First, great paper, Arvind, and I have to be more carefully to get all the points in my head. But really good. This is first question, not a question. Let me first make the statement. But I'm not sure that you give the so-called reformers that early 90s too much credit, because a lot of things didn't get done, not just labor lawlessness, but also when you think about, yes, we got rid of industrial licensing, but when it came to import licensing, for all consumer goods, that stayed on till effectively 2004.
And because of the WTO case, we had to
Yeah,
do it.
Yeah,
that's
that was a forced
didn't
thing.
want to waste
Yeah.
time. Point is,
Yeah,
that
true,
didn't happen.
true.
And furthermore, the small scale reservation,
Later.
Yes.
you know,
that was
which was there,
another
and
very
was really, I think those who worked on it at least tell me that really throttle stuff. That was phased out well into the
Early
2000.
2020.
Yeah.
2005.
So, I mean, with this, what I'm trying to grope towards is do those phenomena and somehow relate to the data you see of multi-plant. Maybe it's extraneous. Whatever is problem is uniform across instruments of policy distortion, but I have a feeling it's not. You may be getting more multi-plant type activity because of those things still being there or being removed at different paces. Let's say. So
Yeah, good question. Yeah.
you probably have an answer. Yeah. The other is in the areas where we developed capacity, both in domestic and exports, auto components, pharmaceuticals, and there are presumably others. What is the story around the issue? Do they reflect this phenomenon or don't they? If not, what? Thank you.
We'll take about 4 questions.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, this side, yes, please.
The role of demonetization. But after demonetization, lot of these MSMEs and SMEs, perished. My second question is that what we are finding that lot of this rural demand is basically getting left to these brands, FMCG brands like Nestle, Procter and Gamble. They are the one who are opening plants, because so that they can expand, to the rural, they can cater to that market. But not about the high-end manufacturing, because Apple and all of these, they are basically not more in the assembling or in the downstream level.
Okay,
Not in.
okay.
Yeah, some youngsters.
Lavish, yeah.
Next round, let's go to the youngsters.
I love the narrative.
Women.
Yeah,
So with a
Okay.
woman chairperson, you shouldn't worry, but I think
you're good.
missing out.
The desire to remain small. I think essentially that's what you come to. I don't think anyone can argue with that, anyone who's at least interacted with us. But I do suspect I have deep problems with some of the issues that you raised here. First, I used to work on this data about 20 years back. Multi-plants is a very well-known phenomenon amongst researchers. It's not something that has not been known. This particular question may not have been seen in that perspective. And so one of the issues that comes up in this is that a lot of these multi-plant firms tend to be in the food processing sector. At least I'm talking about my understanding from 20 years back. I really haven't worked on it in the last 20 years. Used to be in the food processing sector. And that used to essentially happen because things like bread and dal and so on used to have multiple units within the state or a geographic location. Now, it would be really nice to see if across sectors, what are the stories coming back. Related to that is exporting plants, again, in data from the past, used to be far larger than units that were focused on the domestic sector. So essentially, so if you were servicing the domestic market, you tended to be small. If you were exporting, then you tended to be large. So the causality could also be going the other way around. So that's so I would suggest that, one may want to look into some of these issues and disentangle between, at least see some of the sectors separately, and also build in the age of the unit. That has a very large role to play in the size, in the size calculations as well. Finally, the desire to remain small. I completely agree with you. There is a problem of labor laws, but it's not just labor laws, it's the political economy of labor laws.
Exactly.
And it's not just the 200, 300 number,
Exactly.
It's also the Contract Labor Act. So the way the Contract Labor Act works is that effectively, if you go into the court system, some parts of it are seen very, very stringently by the judiciary. Just that gets me to my last point. So essentially, it's not just one law; it's actually the whole menu of these laws that exactly address.
Exactly.
We'll take one last question. Prerna? Yeah.
Yeah, so I just saw in one of the slides you mentioned about Shahi exports. So we also got a chance to visit Shahi exports, and the way their model operates is that they say that they situate themselves, locate themselves towards, where the labor availability is. For example, they're also planning to set up plants in Odisha because they see labor availability there. So what my point is that how do we decide on, but not all firms can be Shahi exports because it's one of the largest exporters of India. So they can probably afford to locate themselves in centers where there's labor availability. But if one is not Shahi exports, then how do we solve the problem of, probably demand of a particular type of labor, for a particular sector, as compared to, the supply of labor? So is the solution is setting up these hostels or dormitories, but then it would require things like land and capital investment. So how do we decide on this model of bridging the supply and demand gap?
Okay.
Okay, first, I want to come to something that Montek said, but I'll do that at the end. Let me respond to the questions. Firstly, thanks for, really excellent questions. I may not be able to answer all of them because we also want to have more questions. So my apologies if I don't answer your specific question. See, the question you asked about, the PSUs and things, in this, we deliberately did not look at public sector units because, we wanted to focus on the regulatory framework, which is more applicable to, the public sector has its own regulatory track, labor law track or whatever. So
We use 2003 data, so that's fine.
yeah, sure. And certainly it's worth looking at, and we haven't done. Shankar, first response is that I think firstly, absolutely that, some things were done later than you would have wanted. But that's precisely why, because the coverage, the time coverage of our data actually begins when SSI was eliminated, and it's about 20 years after that. So the puzzle really is even 20 years. I mean, maybe it's not enough because we had that for such a long time, that regime, but certainly even after 20 years. So this would be a completely uninteresting question if you were to ask this for the 80s or 90s, because, there were so many other bad things happening. So the real question here is why, even after 20 years, after most of those bad things were eliminated, we still don't see that. So in that sense, my response would be that even if they've had an impact, their impact should have diminished over time, and hence this multi-plant seems to be, size remains to be small, and multi-plants seem to be, a phenomenon which could partially explain that. I think you and Lavish are exactly right, and we can do this. We've done a little bit of this to look at what happens in some of the other sectors like auto components and pharma or food processing. I think that's certainly something we try and disentangle, and it's something that Montek also said. I think we shouldn't get into a big debate on demonetization here, but I think that remember that even if we were to think seriously about demonetization, which we should, that would focus more on what happens on kind of the left tail, the small scale industries, as you rightly said. Here we're focusing on the right tail, which were arguably less affected than that. So that's why I want to focus on the right tail. I think all that you said, Lavish, about food processing, we do find exporting plants are bigger, and controlling for age is something that certainly we will look into. But I do think that the last point that you mentioned is really one of the key things that I would like to reinforce, that this is much broader than just it is about the political economy of labor capital relations in India, and how governments fit into that, and therefore it's not just about change the law, as it were. And maybe I'll come back to this in just a second. I want to say one thing related to this. On Shahi exports, I think you're absolutely right that Shahi exports, and I've spoken extensively to Mr. Harish Ahuja, they remain small for two reasons. One, as you rightly said, they go to find a female labor force. And so that means they have to, if it's geographically dispersed, by definition, your firms have to be smaller. But they also do it in order to, not to become too big. In fact, the thing that, still echoes in my ear is when Mr. Harish Ahuja, early in my tenure in government, said, sir, I will never have a 10 or a 15,000 employee plant. It's too much risk. But there are other factors as well, which I think is very. Now, the thing I want to, building on something that Montek and Lavish you said, and this is where I think the problem is in terms of policy. When you focus on changing the law or whatever, etc., I think what we kind of completely underestimate is, even all this ease of doing business, they're like tick marks. Oh, is your whatever 2 days rather than 6 days. The point is that these things, labor capital relations, whatever, are kind of created by years and years and decades of performance or non-performance of governments and the experience of firms with government. That's why I make this distinction. Josh Feldman and I wrote a written piece on why we don't get private investment. I think all of us and this government has been very good at trying to increase the returns to investors. You cut a labor, corporate tax rate, you do PLI, but the risks of doing business is something different altogether. It requires decades and decades of doing the right things and creating. I'll give you one example, which I mentioned in my piece on Tamil Nadu, which I think is actually, to me, why I got so excited about the Tamil Nadu experience. Ford Motor Company, in 2021, they wanted to leave Tamil Nadu for purely business reasons. They had an auto plant there. They said, we're kind of calibrating at the global level. We're going to leave. I mean, I shouldn't be saying this in front of all of you stalwarts, but almost every government in India would have tried to say, why are you going? We will not let you go. How dare you, etc. Tamil Nadu government actually facilitated their exit. They said, you have an employee problem, we'll kind of sort it out. You have a land issue, we will sort it out. 2024, Ford is again recalibrating its global strategy, and they said, that experience, we're going to come back and relocate in Tamil Nadu. So that's what, so this facilitating exit to incentivize entry is something really deep and, something that policymakers should really internalize. It's about doing the right things again and again and again and again. It's not a matter of, and this whole discussion about the IDA and 100, it's almost as if we've come to believe that, you have to pull levers and, private investment will come. This is about, much more creating credibility, reputation, so on, which requires years and years of, doing the right things and so on. So that's but let's go to the next round of
Okay,
questions.
next, please. Yeah, please. Yeah. Mike, please, can you?
One thing I didn't hear very much, under political risk, perhaps that's what you meant though, is issue of political risk, what it is. The whole business of election finance, and it's sort of waved up and down, very difficult to observe. I would hypothesize that amongst political risk, that's a huge one. And I don't mean just giving money from A to B, but using the instruments of state also to extort. So that too.
But can I respond to that? Here I would say, I'm being a little bit glib, but it's part of the response at least, is that the risks of doing business is not incompatible with extracting a lot of rents up front. This is the stationary bandit versus the roving bandit thing. The stationary, the roving bandit is a bandit. He may still extract, but he will extract at say a certain point in time, and then your kind of thing. Sorry, the stationary bandit would. It's the repeated risks of this which I think create this. So it's compatible in principle.
Okay, next, Rajesh.
Yeah, I must point out that the young lady.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was.
Constantly
What we
raising
asked,
her
that's
hand,
what
I
I
feel very guilty.
Yeah, I also feel
You
very
should
guilty.
give it to
Sorry.
her.
More questions. One is the government has tried codifying labor laws. It's not been implemented yet. but it appears from what you said and what Lavish said, it's not going to help much. So is that a correct assessment?
I would think,
Second,
yeah, it's a necessary but not
That's a
sufficient
question.
condition, yeah.
Second, it appears the systems in India have become business friendly, but not necessarily market friendly. Is that a correct way to put it?
Okay, next, yeah, please. Right at the back.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I have few questions. One is the issue that you're talking about. Is it a central government issue? Is it a state government who actually solves for it? Second, is the problem just restricted to labor-intensive firms or capital-intensive firms are also facing the same issues? Because in India, capital-intensive firms are more productive. And now they're also globally competitive. We perform really well in chemical production and automobile. And third, you talked a lot about Tamil Nadu success story. So what is it that they did differently that even the labor intensive industry of leather is now expanding so much?
Professor Golda?
Yeah, first of all, I should say,
You are
this is a very interesting, sorry?
No, go ahead, no, go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah, this is a very interesting paper, and I think based on this, other people will also undertake research on the questions that you raised. But I want to draw your attention to a data set, which I think will be more apt to do this type of analysis, and I will inclined to use that, which is Prowess, because Prowess has within it, for each company, location of its factories. And so you can see single plant company, multi-plant company, all plants in the same state, or multi-plant company, plants in different states. You can identify each company. And to my understanding, what I remember is, compared to single plant company, a plant having a company having all plants in the same state will be about double that size. And a company having multiple plants in different states will be 4 to 5 times bigger in size. So a multi-plant being less productive than a single plant company is, to my mind, not possible. This one, observation one. Second is annual survey of industries. If I have to do the same study, I will not use annual survey of industries. The reason is this provision of joint return has been given for a very specific purpose. This is somebody who is a small businessman, has couple of factories, cannot give individual return. He is given the facility that you combine the return for all 3 factories and give it. Suppose somebody has a factory, but it has to be in the same state and same 3-digit industry. Suppose you have 2 factories in different 3-digit industries, you have to file 2 returns. Suppose you have same 3-digit industries, 2 factories in West Bengal, 1 in Bihar, then for West Bengal, you have to file a return. For Bihar, you have to file another return. So given this sort of complication in the case of joint returns, well, I would not like to use ASI. I would rather go to Prowess. But otherwise, very useful. And I think I'm very much inclined to take up this research.
Okay. Any other questions, please? Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. So, in your presentation, whether it's single plant or multi-plant, on average, they're employing more than 1,000 employees. And like you said, labor laws are not the only reason.
Can you hold the mic up
Yeah.
there?
And labor laws are not the only reason. So what are the other reasons that you feel have restricted these companies to being small? Like Shahi Exports, you said they don't want to grow. So what else is there? Second question is more related to data. On one of your slide, you tracked the same company in 2005 and in the later years. So how have you been able to do that? I think ASI doesn't give that facilities.
Okay, one question from this side, and yeah.
Hi.
Are you responding
Yeah,
or what?
got it.
No, are you responding to the question?
No,
or
no,
asking?
I have
Okay,
a
yeah.
question.
yeah.
So it's on the China plus one, basically. So I was reading when the part of the Bretton Woods went in 1971, Kissinger asked the cabinet, what is it that we should do now since the gold is moving away? We need to set dollar straight. So one of the cabinet persons wrote a half a letter note to Kissinger and said, let's involve China. to fund our deficits. Because 1971 is when US started getting into trade deficits from being a trade surplus. And from then you see China being a giant that it is right now. You don't see a pushback to China up until 2014. There were murmurs, but not an actual pushback. But from 2014 to now, it's an open trade war. Primarily for the reason that China is now getting into non-kinetic AI spaces where US wants to have its hegemony. And that's where the recent Nobel laureates paper, AJR's paper, institutions come into play. So how much do the role of institutions in the larger political economic landscape globally facilitate the investments in India, and by virtue of which we can diversify what you're talking about?
Okay, can we take one more, or we'll come back? I
No.
think we've got 3 questions. We'll have it in the next round.
Is one, yeah.
We're still at 1:20, so 5 minutes to respond, and then one more round of 3 questions.
Yeah, just again, business friendly versus market friendly. I think that is an important distinction. But I think the point is that, business, even within being business friendly, there's, returns versus risks. And I would like to suggest that, we've not been bad at doing returns, but the risk environment have not been sufficiently addressed, I think, which requires a lot more consistent action. Center versus state, I think wherever you have this, I think definitely it's a combination. I think both jurisdictions play a role. Because, as you know, labor laws are both governed by center and state. And in some ways, both, something that, the center sets a certain example, states can follow, or some states set a certain example, others can follow. So I think it could be both. But in this analysis, we focused mainly on states, because that's where the data are, or the data are disaggregated. And I think the labor versus capital intensive, I think this phenomenon also you see in capital intensive industries, and we've done it exactly on that. And it's also there, and it's also has the same kind of impact that, if you remain small in terms of employment, you will get similar kind of impacts. Now, you asked the question about why Tamil Nadu is able to do this, especially in labor-intensive industries. And that's a really good question. Part of what I've been saying, of course, is that, they've been more consistent in the way they've treated manufacturing and business. So they've created an environment where investors feel much more, i.e., in terms of my distinction, they've not just offered high returns, but they've also created a more stable risk environment than others. And my Ford example was trying to illustrate that. By the way, there's a recent Samsung strike that happened there, went on for 37 days, and it's been resolved, again, with the government playing the role of an honest interlocutor between labor and capital, even though it's a fairly tricky political issue we can talk about. But but there's another reason, which is about the good question. Why does Tamil Nadu attract labor intensive? So the Tamil Nadu labor market has 3 kind of, I would say, segments. One is the local engineering graduates, et cetera, who are more at this, on the skill spectrum, they're a bit higher. But because of what Montek said, labor coming in from elsewhere, and women. Remember, all these labor-intensive industries employ women, are labor-intensive. They are therefore able to tap into a slightly cheaper labor pool than the local one. So that's the way in which Tamil Nadu kind of has both. That's why you see both relatively skill-intensive investment, auto components, parts, etc., but also attracting this because they're attracting these slightly less expensive pools of labor, like the Bihari coming in and so on. So in fact, and that will create its own problems down the road, but a sizable chunk of the labor force in Tamil Nadu is women and, migrants from other states. So I think that's now,
Just add a point. I think let's not underestimate the quality of political leadership. The fact is that Tamil Nadu for a long time, the ministers have all been, or many of them have been actually professionals, and they've worked in businesses. That is not the case in the North. And I think the difference that makes is unbelievable. I mean, the original Ford case, when that thing first came in, I mean, I was in central government then, but they told me that in Tamil Nadu, the chief minister asked one of the IAS officers that, why don't you go and talk to different companies and tell them to come and find out what it is that they're looking for, and then we'll decide whether we can give it to them. Most of the chief ministers in the North believe that's a good idea to have a rally in which 50 businessmen come and each one announces a memorandum of understanding and then goes home. So, I mean,
Leadership matters.
look,
right?
I mean, Mamta Di kicked out the Tatars and is quite proud of it.
No, but a quick point there. What about Gurgaon
What?
and Haryana? Haryana with the first Maruti Suzuki,
Yeah.
Delhi NCR.
Well, that's
Hero
I mean,
Honda,
that's a spillover effect of Delhi. And I mean, I agree that an awareness both in I mean, Noida, for example, is managed in UP with much greater professionalism than the average UP town. And the same thing is true of Gurgaon.
So now, I have,
Quick-
yeah,
quick
no, yeah,
answer.
because, on the China thing, I think we should actually, the China plus one opportunity is now because of, the powers that be taking action against China. So in that sense, it is. Now, on the data question, my second quarter, and the thing, Naveen has come in. Naveen and Abhishek should answer the question on prowess and data, because we're aware of these. But Naveen, could you respond, please?
Just to add one point before I go on to the data issue, Tamil Nadu has almost 1/3 of all the multi-plants in India. Right? So that's one state that tops multi-plants. And there's a little bit more to that in the sense that it also has one of the highest number of IDA cases essentially.
Mhm.
So there is something to do with we're saying that it's attracting labor intensive industries, but this is also the state that has more than 1/3 of all the multi-plants. 40 to 35% of all the multi-plants are in Tamil Nadu. So there's more of the state dynamics than we've actually looked into in this paper. So in terms of Professor Golda, thank you for the comments that you've shared on the data. I have to admit that the multi-plant phenomenon is not for small plants. It is only for large plants because it's looking at the census sector. So the criteria is that it has to be a census plant.
All multi-plants or joint.
Professor Golda,
You have to understand the data. Whenever somebody submits a joint return, it definitely becomes part of census.
So at least the documentation in ASI sort of on one side it says that joint firm is automatically part of census, but when joint returns are defined, it says that it has to be a census plant, and in several points it says that about 100 plants in the documentation. So that's one. And
on the prowess, can you answer the prowess?
Prowess is subsidiary level information, not plant level information, to the best that I've understood prowess. So we'll be able to analyze subsidiaries, but not plants.
And also in prowess, it's very difficult. People have tried to match plants to firms, and it's not as easy. It's not easy to do. But let's
the last
question,
round.
last round, yeah.
And keep your questions very brief, please, Shishir.
Yeah, fascinating paper and very crisp presentation. So what is the role of availability of land in creating the multi-plant thing, right? Because when firms set up plants, they set up plants with some foresight about the demand. And we have also talked to firms, they say, okay, we are building a new plant 500 meters away because there is new demand. So any thoughts on it, and how does it compare with China? Because China has scale. So did they have bigger startup orders to begin with? Thanks.
Sure, Daljit, do you want to ask your question? Okay, anybody else? Yeah, please.
Just a minor question. I mean, when we say multi-plants, it would be very interesting to understand, are these horizontally expanded plants or are they vertically integrated plants which are in form of multi-plants?
Okay.
There's one last question.
Do we have some? Please, yeah.
Hi, Arvind. Just so a name for this paper, Nazar Lagna phenomenon. I think that will work. Second thing, you should be a political scientist. This fits into predatory bureaucracy, predatory politics perfectly. The question is, how much is this money finding its own way? Domestic lenders like small plants, international companies like large plants. I mean, is this different credit and capital markets just separating what they want? And I mean, Indian businesses have struggled to borrow from state-owned banks for 50 years. This is nothing new, except for a few large companies. So how much of this is a credit market problem? And has that really been relieved after 30 years of liberalization?
Okay, I think no more questions? Yeah.
Yeah.
You can have you, please respond.
So to be honest, it's a good thought. We've not really, looked into that carefully as yet. You asked the question about China and land. I mean, I don't know the answer to the question. I've not looked at Chinese land markets, but it is true that, certainly someone who read the paper said that you may do multi-plants also because it's not easy to get big chunks of land, contiguous land, which might make you, force you into doing multi-plants. That's something that certainly we should look into. And the last question was on, there was one more. Oh,
That was
yeah. Oh, no, that's a very good question. So I think we should look into that. Definitely, yeah.
This is all vertical. This is all
Horizontal.
It's all horizontal, okay.
Okay. So thank you so much. I think the mark of a good presentation and a good paper is in terms of the number of questions and multiple dimensions that it has raised, So thank you so much.